I'd like to welcome you to the program. This is another program with Jim Gibb. Tonight's program, we are going to be hearing about dinner at William and Mary Go's plantation, circa early 18th century. And this plantation is in Bowie. Jim was telling me it's right near the Bowie Bay Sox Stadium. Hold on, I'm going to let one more person in here. And this is the first public presentation of this archaeological dig. The place is called Ampthill Grange, and like I said, it's in Bowie, Maryland, up in Prince George's County. And for those of you who have not attended one of Jim's programs, Jim is an archaeologist. He's been in the field for 33 years. Jim, I'm dating you here.
No, it's a lot longer than that.
Okay, well then I have to change my introduction.
45.
45, I'm way off. That's terrible.
I started as a child.
Okay. All right, I don't feel so bad. He currently serves as the director of the Smithsonian Environmental Archaeology Laboratory at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center. I always have to say that very slowly so I don't get all tongue twisted. And Jim is joining us from Annapolis with one of his dogs this evening. And with that, I would like to welcome Jim, and we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks everyone for signing on.
So yeah, we're talking about one particular plantation, and I'll make some reference to some other colonial sites that I've worked on over the years for comparative purposes. But this is an 18th century plantation, which archaeologically isn't there anymore. We basically excavated it out of existence. But it was just south of the Bowie Bay Sox Stadium, and on the east side of Route 301 from the Walmart. So anyway, we're going to talk about William and Mary Go's plantation. Okay, so we've got there, I just wanted to show you this map, approximately where the site is in Prince George's County. Actually, I'm in the wrong place, but we've got half a dozen of these sites that eventually you're going to be comparing the findings to. So let's just move along. Okay, so we've got three different contexts, three different things I want to talk about. First, where are we going for dinner here? Where is this site? And what's around it too, because we want to know the larger social context of the site in the 18th century. And it's a little hard because we don't have maps that show where people were living in that area in the 18th century. We want to know something about what the plantation looked like. You know, if we drove up in our carriage, what would we be looking at? And then finally, what would the interiors look like? What kinds of furnishings? You know, what was their kind of style of living at this plantation? So I'm going to be dealing with each of these three things. We'll start off with, where is it? First of all, finding the site and then exploring it. Before we knew anything about this site, before anybody even remembered it being there, a developer approached the Maryland National Capital Parks and Planning Commission about permits for building, I think at the time it was going to be some sort of shopping plaza. And so the county required that they first determine if there are any archaeological sites in this big farm. And so this is all mostly plowed field, and the developer hired a firm headed by Jeannie Ward, and her team walked across these plowed fields and they looked for artifacts. And in doing so, I'll get a pointer going here. In doing so, she found a cluster of artifacts in this part of the field. She also found a few in this little area. There's an archaeological site there, and what she thought was a mill site over in this area. We're just going to focus on this site here. And so she came back and did some shovel testing. And for those of you who've heard me speak before, you know, we use shovel test all the time, and these are at a particular sampling interval. In this case, probably 30 feet or so. And that's what this map here on the left shows. these open circles are shovel test pits. And in digging those shovel test pits, they collected the artifacts, then looked at their distribution across the site to see, okay, where is the site concentrated? I've taken her data and analyzed it in a slightly different way that I'm more familiar with and easier for me to deal with. And that's basically generating contours like you would with a topographic map, or like you'd on a weather map looking at temperatures. And so using that map, we've got a concentration of material here, here, and a smaller one here. Now, that doesn't mean all these other shovel test pits didn't produce anything. It's just that using a particular algorithm and eliminating some of the noise, we find these kind of three concentrations. And if we look at them with a little greater detail, one of those concentrations is mostly architectural material, particularly brick, and the other is mostly ceramics and glass and that sort of thing. So that suggests there's some structure to the site. So some years later, the developer contracted with me to do additional testing on the site, well, basically to recover the data for which the site was considered important. And so we came back and dug a number of excavation units. And that's what I'll be getting back to in a moment. First of all, some of the background history. The place was originally called Ampthill Grange. Ampthill is a community in the Midlands of England. That's presumably where the name came from. However, as early as around 1700, that name was corrupted to Ampthill Grange, A-M-P-L-E. And so it's had that name ever since. But originally it was called Ampthill Grange in the late 17th century. And it was acquired by the Boyd family. It's an interesting site in terms of archival material in that we actually have a plaque drawn up in 1767, as I recall. And this is basically my tracing of that plat. And the reason that plat was drawn was the heirs of John and Mary Boyd left the parcel, 650 acres, to their children. And so years later, they died, I think Mary Boyd died in 1720s. Their children then divided up the parcel, and so the part we're interested in here is William Go, actually a stepchild. And this is that same plat superimposed on a LiDAR image of the area. And again, for those who've you've listened in on some of my talks in the past, we use LiDAR a lot. And it's sort of like radar in a way, and it allows us to see the topography of a landscape without the trees in the way. And I won't go into the details about how that works, but it's a widely used technology. Here's William Go's 100-acre parcel of Ampthill Grange, and that's where our site is. But you could see other relatives, they've got their parcels here, mostly on relatively level ground, good farmland. The exception being Mary Boyd's dowager portion of the property, where it's much more cut up by streams and everything. And this is also where there was a mill, and I'll get back to that in a moment. Well, I'll get back to it now. This is that LiDAR image. Here's where I think the mill is. This is a close-up view of it. You can see this over here. This is a breached dam. Now, is it a very recent dam? I don't know. I haven't visited because I don't have permission to be on that particular property. It's not part of the area I was hired to survey. But this is clearly a dam meant to impound the creek here. So there's a pretty good chance it was a mill site. And we know from an advertisement from much later in the century, 1799, that the Boyds, Benjamin Boyd, had a mill and was offering it for sale in November of 1799. Now that mill not only means that the family members who, in their particular portions of the tract, they're raising wheat and corn, so it's a place for them to have a ground. But that mill also would have served people up and down this portion of the Patuxent River. All right. All right, what's the matter now? Seem to have frozen up. All right, let's try that again. There we go. This is a much later map, 1861. It's readily available from the Library of Congress, high resolution map. Just go llc.gov, look for maps and Prince George's County, or in this case, Martinet, and you'll see, you'll be able to capture this as I have. But this is approximately where Ampthill Grange would have been in 1861, by which point it was divided up into a number of farms. The reason I'm showing you this is because Queen Anne, the village of Queen Anne, is just downstream. Queen Anne is an early 18th century village, had taverns, warehouses, stores. It's a little bit of a village where you can transact business. And we know that John and Mary Boyd were tavern owners early in the 18th century in Queen Anne. The point being that there's a real connection between this plantation and that village. It was potentially a place where they could sell their produce, you know, for the tavern, or, you know, maybe if they're operating the tavern at the same time, they're providing food, meat and vegetables and grains directly to that tavern. It's also has a small center. It's also a place where you can arrange business deals, loans of money, etc. Also, what I don't have shown upstream a number of miles is the iron forge at Laurel, which would have been in operation in the early 18th century. So there's a bit of river traffic on this part of the Patuxent too, shipping iron, smelted iron downstream for shipment. So anyway, that's pretty much where this plantation was. Again, in Bowie, south of Bowie Basox, in the middle of good agricultural land, only 2-3 miles from a village which had taverns and whatnot. So what did the plantation actually look like? And here, archival records really don't help us very much. There is no description of the place, certainly no map, no drawings, nothing like that. So what we know about the Go plantation is based on what we recover archaeologically. So here again are our maps showing a simulation on the left-hand side of total artifacts, on the right side, breaking it down into architectural and basically household trash. So we use that to go back and say, okay, let's do some sampling of the plowed soils, get a larger artifact sample, which could help us date the site better, might identify certain activities. For instance, if there were doing dairy work, making butter and cheese, we might find a cluster of milk pans, ceramic milk pans in part of the site, and that might suggest a dairy in that location. So we use this map to inform where we would do additional testing, and our additional testing was a series of 40-odd 3-foot by 3-foot excavation units, and here's an example of one such unit. Just taking it down to the subsoil, which you see here, and then looking to see if there are any features. In this case, there are. You can barely see little bits of red here. Those are bits of brick. So there's actually a hole here that somebody dug at one point. And judging from this darkish soil here, it's probably a post hole where somebody dug a hole, set a wooden post in the ground. And this soil over here is undisturbed. So we dug a whole bunch of those. And where did we dig them? Well, we used the distribution of artifacts from the earlier phase to plan our testing. And again, let me see if I can. So each of these large squares represents a sampling frame, and there's 9 to 12 excavation units in each of them, designed again to recover more artifacts. Now, sort of let the sort of jump ahead just for a moment. On the right-hand side, you could see those sampling areas, and you could see clusters of material, brick and ceramics and whatnot. But you might notice there are all these features, and I'll be talking about them, where there are no clusters of artifacts showing in the plow zone. And an area where we had a lot of stuff showing up in the plow zone, there are no features. So it's a little difficult trying to understand what has happened to the site over the course of 250 to 300 years. Suffice to say, however, that there's been a fair amount of erosion of soils. So a lot of stuff has flowed downhill, and a lot of these features have been truncated. They've been, shaved down by plowing. As the farmers plow each year, they lose soil, they have to plow deeper, they lose soil, they plow deeper. So none of these features is as deep as they would have been 300 years ago. From our testing, we did find a concentration of brick in this area of the site, and that suggests a chimney. And in the on this side here, you can see a concentration of nails. So that suggests a frame building, brick up here, frame building down here. Our next step would strike many people as a bit draconian. We took heavy machinery out on the site, but this is a widely used technique in the area, and it's proved very useful. We use machinery to strip off the topsoil, the plowed soil, so we can get down to the subsoil and look for archaeological features. And those include post holes that would have supported buildings and well, whatever else you put a post in the ground for, and trash-filled pits, perhaps, even graves if there were a cemetery out there. There wasn't. And from a Google photograph, you can actually see the area we've stripped is right here. And we piled all the spoil over here. There's just a little clump of trees here. So you get some sense of the scale of our mechanical stripping. Once we've stripped, this whole area, I don't recall how much, but probably 2/3 of an acre or so. Once we stripped out with machinery, we still have to skim it down by hand. And in doing so, we can expose features and map them in. And we did this kind of a little bit funny in this particular project. We did a rough mapping of all the features we could find. That way we could decide, what order we would excavate, actually test features. And then we came back, and as we looked at each individual feature, we redrew it more carefully and remapped it. So here's an area where we exposed a fair amount, and you can see all these flags here represent features. And you can see the darker soil of those features. Those are simply areas where somebody dug a hole in the ground in the past, and it was backfilled. And in most cases, most of these are post holes where wooden posts were set into the ground. To give you an idea, once we've mapped this, and it's all mapped very meticulously with a surveyor's instrument, total station. So this is the entire site, all the features that we found here. And just to give you an example of the kinds of things we're looking at, here's a series of 8 post holes. Here's a more detailed drawing that we did, and each of them has a darker spot of soil in interior, which indicates where a wooden post was set in the ground, and that post was either pulled or decayed in place, and so we've got darker soil in amongst the mixed soils. And here's a photograph of that same structure. You can see the post holes. Darker soil with a post mold inside. Actually, that might be a different one. Another structure we found, another small structure, a series of post holes forming the corners. This one we never investigated. And inside, we found a smaller group of 4 post holes and molds, one of which we didn't investigate. And it's interesting because they're at different orientations. And this one's 4.3 by 4.3 from center to center of the post molds. This larger one's around 11 by 8 feet. The thing is, these wooden posts are set in the ground, and I suspect the frames were laid on top of them. So they probably stuck up, a foot or two above grade. And then they put frames on top of the post. So those wooden frames on which the buildings were constructed probably overhung these posts somewhat. So the actual buildings were probably larger than the post mold patterns would suggest. In the southern part of the site, we have 2 of these long structures, which I'll get back to in a moment. Here you can see this cluster of post holes, and notice how they overlap. You could actually figure out a sequence of which hole was dug and then replaced by another post. So these things were probably up long enough where those certain wooden posts failed, and so they had to dig it out and put it in a new one. And that's what that overlapping here suggests. These images over here are just profile drawings of these post holes after we excavated them. So here, this is the site as a whole. These are all these archaeological features, and they represent, well, here's the interpretation. So we've got the principal dwelling up here, which I think was made of log. It was a log house because we got very few nails in that area. But it did have a brick chimney and had a partial earthen cellar with some stonework. It looks like this whole building was cannibalized. I'll show you an image in a moment, which explains why I think that's true. And it looks like it had some sort of frame addition to it over here, made of just said wooden post in the ground. We've got a fence line here, two fences actually, a privy, which again I'll show you an image or two in a moment, a series of trash-filled pits surrounding a small outbuilding, which I just showed you, another fence, another outbuilding here, and then we've got these two structures, and this thing is in my way. We have two structures, two long structures, which I think are dwellings. And they're odd dwellings because the post, based on the post, the width is only 7 or 8 feet. And the length is, I don't know, 20 to 35 feet or something like that. But one of the reasons I think they're dwellings is that they are privies right next to them. And what I think was probably a fourth privy, we had a privy up here associated with the main house. We have two privies associated with this slave dwelling. We have archaeological evidence indicating that one replaced the other. So when they dug a new privy, they basically backfilled the old privy with soil and stone that came out of the new one. And we never looked at it carefully, but I think there's actually another privy right here associated with this structure. So I think my guess is that these are slave dwellings. And I see it's not cooperating again. My machine is frozen up a bit. Okay, I'll try this again. So here's what I think was the log structure, and this mass here is all brick rubble. We found very few complete bricks. The vast majority of them were broken, which again suggests to me that somebody had come along at a later date and cannibalized or salvaged the bricks from this building, as well as some of the building stone. And then we have this frame structure next to it. We've got, this is that image down here. So we've got a series of excavation units. We dug into it, and you can see all the brick rubble in the profile. You can see the brick rubble in this profile here. This is clearly all, somebody salvaged the brick, and this is all the rubble fill. Most of the soil in this cellar hole, we can see is washed in. You can see it in the stratigraphy. If you look carefully, you can see the layers of soil that have washed in. And you think, well, how can you get that much soil washing into a hole 3.5, 4 feet deep? We found, well, during the course of excavating the site over, I don't know, 8 months or so, that every time it rained, when we came back and looked at a post hole we excavated, for instance, it had virtually refilled with sediment. The soil on this site is highly erodible, so it doesn't take very long for a lot of soil to move and fill in low spots. Look at this. My machine has frozen up yet again. Come on. This is the first time in the talks we've had where we've had mechanical difficulties. There we go. Boy. So here's one of those privies. And it doesn't look like much. In fact, when we first uncovered this one and the one over here, I didn't think too awful much of it. You know, there was a bunch of fieldstone in it, just, you know, it's natural to that soil, although deeper down in the soil column. But there was nothing, I figured they were just more of these trash-filled pits. And when we excavate them, you could see starting to excavate one here. Here's Anton Motivans down here digging away. I think that's Anton down there too. And now here's Olivia down, standing at the bottom. We didn't dig out the north half of this particular privy. This one here was, I think, 8 feet deep. So you can see one of these things on the surface, lots of stone. In this case, actually cut through 2 earlier post holes. So this privy was dug at a time when there was already something there on the ground. Here it is in profile, including part of this post hole here. I'm not going to use my pointer again because I think that might be screwing up my advance here. But most of the material in here is redeposited. It has some artifacts in it, but it's mostly redeposited soil, little bits. It's out of context. It's not very useful from a research perspective. But this layer and this layer down here, 4 had very little in it. We're getting down into basically undisturbed subsoil. But this layer here, very rich in artifacts. Lots of bone, lots of ceramic. So those are the kinds of features we're looking at. Now to talk a little bit about feature definition. Here we're actually excavating these post holes, and we excavated the vast majority of them on site because we were interested in how deep are they? What artifacts do they have in them? How do they relate to one another? Because when you have a whole bunch of post holes, you want to figure out which go with which. Do we have one building succeeding another? Or we adding on to buildings? We need to get data, and we do that by carefully documenting these things and then excavating. So here's Olivia excavating one of those post holes, enjoying herself, as you can see. And let's see if we can highlight this. And in red. Here's a post hole. Part of a post hole. I can't. Here's part of an, oops, here's part of another post hole. And this is a post hole that cut through both of them. Sorry, I don't have a very steady hand. And this is the mold from the actual post. So what this tells us is that there were 2 post holes here previously. Maybe one replaced another, we don't know. But then this one was dug to replace both of them. There are no other molds like this. So clearly whatever wooden posts were here were removed and this new one was in place. And you can see that partially excavated here and then completely excavated here. Huh, it worked. Here's another kind of post hole. They were just like one another, although related to 2 different buildings. And you can see this dashed line here. This is where the original post hole was. The hole was much larger at the top. And when we first found this post hole, there was no evidence of a mold. Same thing with this one here. These are 2 examples of post holes where the post was dug out. And so we end up with a larger hole at the top. So they removed enough soil so they could wiggle the post free, and then they backfilled it. So these 2 are examples of posts that were removed and never actually replaced. And you can see I showed you this before, a sequence of posts. So these 2 are still standing, as is this one too probably, when this one was dug to replace this one here. Pit features. So those are post holes. They're really important for telling us where the buildings are, how big they were, how they relate to one another. Another important feature on the side are the pit features. These are holes dug in the ground, usually 5 to 15 feet in diameter. On this site, not very deep, I think, again, because most of them have been truncated by plowing over the centuries. They probably fulfill certain purposes, so although we call them pit features, some pits were probably used for some things, some pits for others. They're not very deep, again, ½ foot to a foot deep. We had 14 of them that I think we excavated all of them, at least sampled all of them. Most of them had very few artifacts in it. Most of them had very few bones in it. Most of them consisted of a layer of thin, fine white wood ash at the bottom, covered over by redeposited soils, stuff that just washed in. So people were digging these pits, but we don't really know what they were used for. It's unlikely that anybody was digging a pit just to discard trash. They were digging pits for all sorts of reasons. And once you have a pit, it's fulfilled its purpose, then it becomes a convenient place to throw garbage. Feature 114 is the example. It was very rich in material, and that's what you see here on the right-hand side of the screen, including the stratigraphy. Again, it's some fine ash in there, and then redeposited material on top. Whoops. One of the ways we could distinguish the different feature types is by looking at the contents. And you can see this is a simple graph. The numbers along the bottom are numbers of identified bone. And we have mammal bone, fish bone, bird bone, not breaking it down by species, just these little larger clades. And you can see feature 114, which is a pit, and feature 112, which is a privy, have a lot of bone in them. Feature 115 has a little, most of them don't have a lot of bone in them, and most of the bone they have is just mammal bone. So that suggests that this feature here, 114, is different from the other pit features. We know 112 is different because it was a privy. We know what its function was. The other pits, we don't really know. We have to base it on their contents, or in this case, lack of same.
Jim, how can you tell the difference between, what are the signs that it was a privy? Is that the limestone at the top or the depth of it?
It's basically a cylindrical feature. It's up to 4 feet in diameter, goes straight down. And it also has layers of interbedded fine ash at the bottom. Privies smell really bad. And one way of keeping down the odor in a privy is to throw wood ash in there periodically. And that would have helped a little bit. Frankly, all of these privies were right next to buildings. And we would never see that today, or even in the past 100 years or so. The idea that somebody would put a privy less than 50 feet or probably less than 100 feet from their house would be, people would respond to that with a degree of disgust. It smells really bad. So that tells us something right there about these people 250, 300 years ago, a different sense of what's appropriate. But the privies really stand out. They're all cylindrical, all three of them. They're cylindrical, 3 to 4 feet in diameter, go down 6 to 8 feet. Whereas the pits are kind of basin shaped, fairly shallow. So here's that one pit, mostly excavated. So you can see it's not very deep and it's not very complex stratigraphically speaking. One of them, this is actually feature 114. Those are George Reisling's knees there, I can tell from the camo. We found the cranium, a part of the cranium from a cow. And it's sitting right at the bottom. What the significance of that might be, we don't know. It might have been just thrown in there. George is in the process of removing it. We had to encase it in plaster of Paris to keep it from falling apart. You'll notice here, one of the horns has been sawn off. And so they're using the bone for some purpose. We saw that with a deer skull we also found where antler tines were sawn. The entire antler rack actually was sawn off the head. So these settlers they're making something with these bits of bone. So anyway, those are the pits. Now to get into, what's going on inside these houses, and how are they what are they eating and how are they eating it? That comes from vessel analysis and by looking at the bones. So here are some images of the ceramics we've recovered, a large basin here. I don't have a scale in there, but it's roughly 8 inches in diameter. It's very thinly potted, nice salt glaze white stoneware. We have on a different scale here, a saucer. It's white salt glaze, so is this. This is pretty fine stuff, really just 18th century. Most of it probably dates somewhere between the early 18th century and the end of the century. We have some very nice Chinese ceramics, obviously brought here at some expense. Some really finely potted, well-decorated material that would have been used on table, just as the white salt glaze I just showed you. These are all tablewares. These aren't used for cooking or storage or processing food. And then we have some fairly nicely decorated European wares, a lot of what's called Staffordshire slipware, comb slipware. These images at the bottom are Staffordshire. This piece up here is also Staffordshire, as are these pieces too, all of them really, except for this piece of tin glazed earthenware. These are all English ceramics, mostly from the Midlands or possibly London, in the case of the white tin glaze there. Again, all used on the table. These probably more serving vessels rather than individual plates. An ointment pot for tin glazed earthenware, also probably from the London area. This thing is only about 2.5 inches in diameter. Wine bottles, not as many as I would have guessed. I mean, typically for colonial sites, we find a lot of wine bottles, relatively few here. Some nice porcelain teacups and some creamware, which suggests that the site is occupied sometime into the 1760s and 1770s. We don't find another kind of ceramic that was widely used in the 1780s and later, 1780s, 1790s. And that's what puts this site occupation sometime between the 1720s and 1770s. And then some nice stonewares. This is a base of a mug that would have been, about 4 inches in diameter and maybe 5 inches high, called Westerwald. On the left, upper left, is a British brown stoneware drinking mug, obviously for beer and cider, and some other larger vessels that were probably used for storing cider or beer. We don't have any direct evidence, but I wouldn't be surprised if these folks were making their own beer and cider. Okay, we were, after all, invited to dinner at William and Mary Go's plantation, so let's get some sense of what these folks were eating. We'll look first at the plant remains, and these were all identified by a local, actually a regional and regionally important ethnobotanist named Justine McKnight. And you can see here, we got a couple of these 7-row corn. So this is a corn cob here. It's been burned. That's why it survives archaeologically. It burned. 7 rows. It's northern flint corn. This is not your silver queen or sweet yellow corn. This stuff would have been very hard grained and would have to be dried and milled for cornmeal. It's not the sort of stuff you eat on the cob. Now, why this and a couple of other cobs were burned and therefore survive, otherwise they would rot away. They probably were used for fuel, maybe even to start a fire. We have some burned wheat, which is important. We tend to think, well, scholars tend to think of people in this area as growing basically corn and tobacco and not much else. But we've been finding wheat on a number of these colonial era sites. And that suggests that they are growing wheat and taking it to a mill to be turned into flour. They would have been, if they weren't growing wheat, they would have bought flour. They probably wouldn't have bought actual unmilled wheat. And then we have a common bean here, important in the English diet. We also found, not in any particular context, this is after we stripped the site, we found this basically a big rock. And it's an interesting rock because it appears to be what we call burr stone, B-U-H-R stone, imported from France and used for making millstones. Millers love this material for making, for millstones for grinding grain. And it would be, for those of you who, some of you might remember if you were in on the mill talk, they brought these things over in pieces, and they were kind of fitted together in France, shipped over here in pieces, and then fitted back together again to make a millstone. And this might have been a scrap. It's hard to say, but it was very clearly used as a milling stone, used by hand to grind grain. So these folks, the Goes, may have been doing a little hand grinding of grain as well, probably for immediate use when the mill wasn't running. In terms of wood found at the site, again, this is all charcoal. Plain, unburned wood just isn't going to survive very long. But charcoal, if it's undisturbed in the soil, could last tens of millennia. Well, Justine went through a lot of this charcoal, and she really identified three species: hickory, oak, and oh God, I don't remember what the other one is. But you've got oak here, Quercus, two types, red and white, and Carrier, that's hickory. There are some other types too, tulip poplar and whatnot, but in very small numbers. These folks really were dealing with two kinds of wood, oak and hickory. And that suggests that that area was heavily forested with oak and hickory, and not with what you see today, which is mostly fast-growing trees like tulip poplar. Here's that deer cranium we recovered from one of the features, and you could see the saw marks. I mean, they're very distinct. Someone was clearly trying to remove the antlers from this deer skull, and they were doing it in a really amateurish way. And actually, we see that on a lot of colonial sites. When we look at the bones, we see a lot of cuts in the wrong places, like someone trying to cut through the middle of a thigh bone, which is, Eddie Cook will tell you, you cut at the joints. That's the easiest place, and you cause the least damage to the meat. These folks, they're spending time trying to cut away this thing. They need to take the antler off here, where they eventually did. Same thing on the other side. But we do see a lot of inexperienced butchering on these colonial sites. And I think that's because a lot of these settlers came from urban areas or villages where they had specialists who did the butchering. And so when they finally come over here and settle in the Chesapeake region, they know how to do a lot of things, but they're not expert butchers. And so they're learning as they go along. It really shows in the bones. In terms of the kinds of meats, the flesh we're finding, and here I'm comparing it to several other sites, so it makes a little bit of sense. And I won't go into the details of these sites, but they all date to the late 17th and early 18th centuries. Mill Branch, or Go Plantation, is the blue dots. And so you can see that here. You can see where cow is, chicken, white perch, and might be rockfish. Rockfish and white perch are very difficult to distinguish. They're the same genus, different species, even though they have different behaviors, and they're found in different waters. But just down here, and that's not surprising, there's not a lot of fish on this site because, well, they're on the Patuxent River. What are we going to find? We're going to find white perch and catfish. And you do get a little bit of catfish here. And a little bit of deer, a little bit of sheep, good deal of pig, more pig than cow. This is just based on a number of identified bones. So we get some idea of the kinds of flesh they're eating. They're not doing a lot in the way, they're doing a little bit of fishing. They're doing very little in the way of hunting. There are some species that show up. There's wolf, and there's red fox there, I suspect, and raccoon, but only one or two pieces. It's not a lot. They're really subsisting largely at this site on pig and cow. And you can see how that compares to what folks at some of these other sites are doing, where there's a lot more preference for cow, less preference in some cases for pig, more in other cases. So there's variability among these sites, among these plantations, as to what they're eating in the way of flesh. And that potentially is very important. How important it is going to take some time. We need more sites and more detailed analyses of each of these collections. But you get some idea of what they're eating. In terms of domesticated species, you can see galliforms are basically chicken, not modern day chickens, let's call them yard fowl. It could be guinea hens and a variety of birds. We get ovis, which is sheep, sus, which is pig, bos, which is cow. Look at the variability in terms of the percentages of bones identified for each of those species for these 5 sites. It's all over the place. And that suggests we've got very different diets. And some of the reason for that diet might be because they're occupying different environmental areas, different ecozones. And so some areas, like 2 of these sites, sparrows and shaws are on the property of the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center. They're right near the water. They have access to a lot of fish, but even they, you could see their distributions here, they don't have the same diets. One is preferring beef over pork, for instance. Idlewild Farm is a site that's well inland. They're focusing on pig, very little cow, and very little in the way of sheep. But our friends at Mill Branch, this is their distribution here, kind of the middle road, if you will, but an emphasis on pig, less on cow, a little bit of sheep, fair amount of yard fowl, though. We got a lot of, let's call them chicken bones on this site. We can, for all these sites, we can combine all the number of bones identified of cow, pig, sheep, etc. And we can look at how each of these plantations, how they compare against the average for these 6 sites. So here's the average here. Mill Branch is way over on this end. In terms of species diversity, there's a lot more species represented at this site than at any of the other sites. 3 of these sites, although are above the mean, and 3 are below. Okay, so to sort of circle back and figure out where we've gotten with all of this. Where are we eating? Where's dinner being held? Well, it's a goat plantation. We know it's a relatively small tract. 100 acres is not a lot in the 18th century. Especially since soil is often exhausted after just a few years, so you have to keep moving around that 100 acres and plow new land. So it's a relatively small farm, but it's one that is part of a group of farms owned and occupied by an extended family. And that's interesting in and of itself, because you've got family members living side by side, so they can share labor. They can share food when food is scarce. It's almost like a family compound, if you will. And the thing is, they didn't divide that plantation up until 1767, I think. Well, John and Mary Gow both died in the early 18th century. They held this land in common for decades before they decided to legally divide it up. And so that suggests that they're actually working together quite a bit. There's no need to formalize their individual inheritances, although they're almost certainly occupying those tracts of land. We know there was a mill there because we have an advertisement, and I've shown you on the map where I think that mill was. How early it was, we don't know. I haven't done any work on it. It's a totally different property. But it would have provided a service for the extended Boyd family, which included William and Mary Gow, as well as to other plantations in the area. And we know that the elder Boyds, John and Mary, operated a tavern in Queen Anne. We don't know how long the Boyds owned that tavern, but there's clearly a connection there. It was an active little place. Most of the newspaper references I could find to it had to do with pretty much lotteries and drinking. What did the place look like? Well, it looks like, I'm pretty confident we have a log structure that had a brick chimney and an earthen cellar for the principal dwelling where the Goes would have lived. It looks like it had a frame addition. It was almost certainly larger than the 20 by 20 foot cellar we identified. There was a privy 30 feet southeast of the house. And again, 30 feet is awfully close for a privy, for an open hole in the ground filled with human waste. And it suggests certain insensitivity to those smells that we wouldn't tolerate today, or most of us wouldn't. We have a series of partial fences. I think most of them have been plowed away. Most of the fence post holes we excavated were fairly shallow, around a half a foot deep. So we've probably lost most of those fence lines, so we just have remnants of them. But they seem to divide the plantation or the house lot within what we call the curtilage into north, south, east, west lines. And feature 114, that one pit seems to have served as the principal trash pit. And it too was not located very far from the principal dwelling. It was pretty much halfway between the main house and the slave quarters. And those slave quarters were very simple buildings, posts in the ground. There's no clear evidence of them having been heated. They're very narrow. Probably, maybe they housed extended households of slaves. Maybe they were individual laborers. We can't tell at this point. Whoops. In terms of furnishings within the house, it's really hard to tell. We did not recover a lot in the way of internal furnishings apart from glass and ceramic vessels. And frankly, not a lot of those, I think, we came up with a total of, I think, 106 ceramic and glass vessels for the entire site, a minimum number. And you compare that to what's in your cabinets today, you see that's a small number, but still a lot more than you'd probably break in the course of a few years. Well, that's common on these colonial sites, lots of breakage. One bit of interior furnishings we did find is this, what looks like an ash shovel, a hearth shovel for shoveling ashes out of the hearth. If you have a fireplace at home with a bunch of implements next to it, you probably almost certainly have something that looks just like this. It's broken and the ends are bent up somewhat, but it looks like that's what it is, or was. Very few cooking vessels and storage vessels. The storage vessels are mostly stonewares, bottle type things. And the cooking wares, we have a few bowls, but not very much. Most of the vessels we've identified, about 75% of them, were used for individual eating and drinking, used for the table. And it's a little surprising. You would think a plantation, especially with slaves, would have a lot more in the way of ceramic vessels, certainly, for cooking, little porridge pots, porridges, and various sorts of mixing bowls and baking pans that are ceramic, and we just don't see them. It may be that they had a lot of cast ironware. We did find part of a cast iron kettle. And to remind you from the early part of this talk, upriver was the Patuxent Iron Forge, started in the very early 18th century. Colonial British law prevented colonists from manufacturing most things. They were supposed to ship raw materials back to the mother country. They would manufacture them and then send back the goods at a hefty price, value added. But we were allowed to do cast iron wares. And presumably Patuxent Furnace was doing things like fire backs, the iron back of a hearth that would help reflect the heat, and Dutch ovens and cauldrons and stuff like that, iron skillets. So it may be that that is what they were using. And since those things are hard to break and last a long time, they probably were removed from the site when the Goes moved out of there in the 1760s, headed out to Pennsylvania. And in terms of menu ingredients, it's hard to say exactly what we're going to have for dinner here at the Goes plantation. There's still work that we're doing that's going to focus on meat cuts. And again, we'll be comparing that to other sites. Well, we have wheat, and that likely represents white bread. We have maize, which would have been used for cornbread and for porridge. Beans and squash are represented. We found essentially nothing in the way of wild foods, not even grape pips, which aren't unusual, or peach pits or anything like that. They were probably eating that stuff, but probably not in great quantities, and it just didn't wind up in the fire where it could be burned and therefore preserved for us to find. So there might have been peach pits all over the site, but they didn't preserve. They were certainly eating pork and beef to a lesser extent, and a little bit of lamb. They're eating yard fowl. Not only do we find a lot of chicken and turkey bones there, we find a lot of eggshells, little bits of eggshell all over the place. And, a farm, up until the 20th century, your average farm household could probably go through a couple of dozen eggs a day. They're much smaller than the eggs we eat today, but also they were just used along with butter in much larger quantities than we do today. We have evidence of duck and geese, so they're fowling, they're hunting. There's a little bit of deer. You saw that skull. There are a few other bones, but there's not a lot of deer remains from the site. There are virtually no shellfish. We find little bits of oyster shell. A lot of it was actually used for making mortar. So it might have actually been, they might have burned and crushed the oyster somewhere else, turned it to mortar, and then shipped it to the Go plantation. There's not a lot of evidence of them folks eating oysters, which, given how far they are from oyster reefs, it's probably not a surprise. We did find a number of yellow lance mussel shells, and those are very rare in the Patuxent River. In fact, the whole region today, they're not, they're largely extirpated from this area. They're not extinct, but there are relatively few of them around. Whether or not they were eating them or using them for bait, or who knows, flavoring in soups. But we do find a few of their shells there. And then we find the bones of white perch and catfish, which is not unusual given how far up the Patuxent River we are. It's not brackish, it's fresh water. And it's probably slow, shallow moving water, which the catfish love. And the white perch come up to spawn. And we find turtle remains, not as much as we found at some other sites. We have a site down in southern Prince George's County that produced a lot of turtle. So those folks were, yumming that stuff up. We also find some small mammals: raccoon, red fox, rabbit, squirrel, woodchuck. These would probably be eaten, but we also have to keep in mind that they may well have been used for killed for their hides as something to earn a little bit of extra cash. It's easy to transport those down to Queen Anne's and ship them out. I wouldn't be surprised if that happened. It did raise the possibility that some of those pits might have been tanning pits used seasonally to take raw hides and tan them into leather, which is really nasty, smelly work. It doesn't seem very likely. Usually you have tan pits down by the water, and they, like I said, they do smell really bad. So anyway, that's what we've got so far. There's more analysis to be done. But we're getting not only a sense of what these folks ate, but also beginning to compare it to how other colonists in the area, what they ate. And it's not just the meats, the flesh, it's also the plant remains, and we're seeing some real differences among these sites. So anyway, that's about all I've got. I'll stop sharing this.
Jim, I have a question for you while you're filling with the PowerPoint. What would you be able to find that would show that they did eat wild plants? What would be left from that?
Well, on some of the sites, for instance, the Roberts site down in Prince Frederick in Calvert County, we've got some peach pits.
Okay.
Trying to think, I think we might have some cherry, some grape seeds.
Okay.
The problem is, a lot of these foods that are eaten, the only food that we deliberately burn before we use it is coffee. Coffee beans, up until fairly recently, you bought them green, you roasted them yourself, you ground them up yourself. And so there's a chance of finding coffee beans all over the place that burn, they should preserve well. We haven't seemed to find them, not on these rural sites anyway. Other plants, they're not typically deliberately burned, they're accidentally burned. And so what are the chances of a bunch of grape seeds finding their way into the fire and then not burning so hot that they're completely destroyed? So in terms of what we call macro botanical remains, these pieces of charcoal, they're probably not the best way to look at use of wild foods. Pollen is a better way of doing that. What kinds of pollen are present in the soils that would suggest that there's a peach orchard or pear orchard,
Okay.
or there's some viticulture going on. And we're just not, we don't use pollen work very widely in this area at this point. Hopefully that will change. I know George is, who's on this call, has been working with pollen. We figured out a way of extracting it from the soil. Now we have to figure out how to identify the species from the pollen grains that we've recovered. So eventually we'll be doing more pollen work on these kinds of sites, but we can't do it at the Go plantation anymore because it doesn't exist anymore. We dug it out of existence. But we can use these techniques on future sites.
Now, do you think it's, you found less because the land was so, had such a drainage problem?
Preservation seemed to be pretty good.
Okay.
In the features. The major problem we had with this site is so much of it has been truncated by years and years of plowing and a very erodible soil, surprisingly erodible soil. At the same time, their portion of the site, if you strip off that soil, is poorly drained. We had a massive puddle right in the area we stripped with the machinery, but we didn't find any features, so we didn't work in it. But there was a large puddle there, pond, almost a pond, from the time we stripped off the soil until 8 months later when we left the site. There was always standing water there.
Wow.
And that's because of the Cretaceous glauconitic sandy clay on which the soil sits and which those privies were dug into. So anyway, preservation is an issue at every site, and it's the variables are different at each site. So they're never exactly comparable.
We have a question in the chat. This is from Joanne. What happened to the Go family? I think you said they moved to Pennsylvania. Any descendants that are in Pennsylvania today?
I don't know. Well, yeah, they're descendants, so I haven't traced them to see how direct they are. The Go is a Scots name, and they're scattered around Pennsylvania. We're not sure why they moved to Western Pennsylvania. At the time, it wouldn't have been Pennsylvania's, before the American Revolution. That area would have been claimed by Virginia. It may have been that, it was they only had 100 acres, and they acquired a few other acres from one of their family members, up to, I think, 30 acres, but it might have been just too small a piece of land, and all the other land around them was occupied. So when their children came of age, there would be no land nearby to settle their kids onto. That's what motivated a lot of movement. They moved, to Pennsylvania, and in the technical report on this, I go into a little bit of detail on that move because a very odd thing happened about 20 years after they moved. William Go asked for affidavits, not only from people in Pennsylvania, his neighbors, but also his old neighbors back near what's now Bowie, attesting to the fact that he was not an African American, that he was not a Negro. There seems to have been, in Pennsylvania, there seems to have been some people seem to be saying that his father wasn't who he thought he was, that he and his sister were illegitimate offspring of an African, probably a slave, and his mother. And so he was seeking affidavits. I mean, it's interesting, it's disturbing at so many levels, but it does make us wonder, why the move to Pennsylvania, and then why 20 years, why this questioning of his parenthood is very strange. And I haven't gotten to the bottom of it. I've put it in the technical report just so folks know it's there and perhaps somebody can look at it in greater depth. But it's an interesting bit of social history Whether or not it had anything to do with them removing the Pennsylvania, I frankly doubt it, mostly because it took 20 years for it then to become an issue. I think they were just looking for land.
Now, do you think that the fact that their house was probably a log house showed their wealth, their standing?
I suspect that they were not particularly well-to-do, that they had modest means, and even the fancy ceramics they had might have been inherited.
Okay.
A lot of houses in the region were log houses. We know this from sporadic reports, more from Western Maryland, from the manor, various sorts of proprietary manors when they would do census, how many structures there, where they built up and whatnot. Log houses, I think, were a lot more common in Maryland than we think. We tend, in this part of Maryland, we think everything's earth-fast or brick. So you're either living in a house that's built on wooden pilings set into the ground, or you're living in a brick mansion. And I suspect these log houses might have been much more common. We see them into the 19th century too, into the early 20th century. We recently documented a couple in Anne Arundel County, late 19th, early 20th century log houses. So they're probably pretty common. I suspect that's what we have, if nail distributions in the soil is any indication. Any other questions? You're all so quiet, everybody's muted.
Yeah, a lot of people did stay muted.
Okay, so, well, if there's nothing else, there is a technical report on this. It's not available at this point. Perhaps we'll talk to Jennifer Stabler at the county about potentially making this a publicly available document. There are no site locations in it that would be divulged. There are no sites at risk. So I don't think there's any sensitive information in there. It is a technical report, and as such is not made for fun reading. I don't read technical reports for fun. I can't imagine anybody else would. We use them like a dictionary. There's something we refer to. But still, there's a lot of useful information in there, and might be worth taking a look at. We'll just see once the report has been revised and approved by the county and the state, perhaps it can be made more widely available.
Thank you. I also wanted to let everyone know that your next talk will be Monday, August 23rd, and you'll be talking about the one-room schoolhouses in Maryland. So I can send out a follow-up email to the people that have registered, and I'll send that link so that if you're interested in signing up for the next program, you're welcome to do that. Thank you, Jim.
It's a timely talk. It's just before the school year begins. Yeah. So we'll learn a little bit about Maryland's schooling history, particularly since the Civil War.